All right. So I'm excited. We're here today with Derek Lail. Oh, wait, somebody's not muted. Are they? No, we're good. Okay. I hear lots of background noise. I never know if it's school, Zoom, or what's happening. So I'm with Derek today. We're going to be talking about some of his story that he wants to share with us and some of the people and events that changed his path and how he stays well and his passion for trauma-informed work. So Derek, welcome. It's good to be with you.
Thank you. It's good to be here. I appreciate the offer.
And I'm just going to let you tell a little bit about your roles in the community and kind of what you're doing these days, and we'll get started.
Okay. We'll go backwards. I'm currently an instructor of criminal justice at Lee's McRae. It's been by far one of the best jobs that I've ever had. I was just explaining to Denise, having a small school, small group of students. My first day, I walked across campus and 3 people called me by name. I had no idea who they were. It's been phenomenal. But it's given me a chance to, even though I was handed a caseload, or not a caseload, but a course load right out the gate. They also, the colleagues there, the dean of the college, everybody's been super supportive in what direction I wanted to take it. And so I've immediately jumped in with a trauma-informed kind of slant on the criminal justice classes. And it's been nice to have that kind of flexibility, and the students have responded to it really well, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a few minutes.
Yeah, I want to come back to that for sure.
Okay. Before that, I co-owned Rev 5 Fitness, which was a CrossFit style gym in town near the Boone Peds. Before that, worked at App State as the internship director for criminal justice and public administration. Before that, I taught at UNCC in criminal justice, and then I started off as a big boy coming out of college as a police officer in Charlotte. Spent a number of years doing everything from patrol up to federal task force, wiretaps, all that kind of.
Oh, you did. Let's see. Something happened. You muted, Derek. I don't know where your sound went because you're not muted on the screen. Let's try to say something for me. He's got a backup phone just in case. So we're experiencing technical difficulties. Yeah, I can hear that already, I think.
All right, how about now?
Perfect, thank you.
All right, so I don't know how much of that was actually heard. It doesn't really matter. I'm here.
I think the last thing I heard was an officer in Charlotte doing wiretaps, and then it went out after that.
That was about it. Yeah, that was about it.
And so Derek and I, let's see, I'm trying to remember how we met, but we've had a couple conversations around trauma-informed coaching and trauma-informed fitness. And then I did a podcast with you kind of on that same topic. And so that's where I kind of first heard about your passion for trauma-informed stuff. But before we get into that, you and I have never talked about any of the traumatic events that you've experienced, and just hearing the list of different places that you've worked, I can imagine those. But what part of your story would you like to share with us just about traumatic events in your life and kind of how that changed the way you think about things, or the way I always think of it as the lens that we look through as to whether things are a threat or safe? Like, if you can talk to us a little bit about that.
I guess we'll rip the Band-Aid off with that then, won't we? Okay. I would like to think that at this point, my primary role when it comes to trauma is in talking to other people about it. Now it's my students. Before this, the gym, the nonprofit. But what I had to learn through some people who invested a lot in me is, and I do a lot of listening to Brene Brown, but I'll deny this completely when this call's over. That I do that.
We're recording though, so I don't know if you can deny it.
Yeah, I'm getting a laugh from somebody on the screen. And what I've come to understand over the time is that it's not what's wrong with you, but it's what's happened to you. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of people, a lot of leaders and a lot of people who have interactive roles with other people, I'm finding don't have that understanding yet. And so part of having that understanding and part of teaching other people to have that understanding is understanding some of your own story. And that was probably the hardest part of being a trauma-informed leader or educator, is coming to grips with your own story and how to navigate through that story yourself. So my first night as a police officer, I didn't watch, but I responded pretty quickly to two of my own in my division being ambushed and murdered. And one of them was still alive on the scene when I got there. That was night one out of the academy. So that was a little bit difficult to deal with, wrestle with. And they never really did anything for us. There was no, how are you going to handle this? How are you going to cope with this? Do you need anything? It was like, we're going to jump in the van. We're going to throw as many people in the van as we can. And we're going to bum rush the neighborhoods and use the show of force to show that we're still in control of the streets. And that was how we handled the traumatic event. And then move through life, things happen. Interactions with people happen. And, I think none of us are immune to experiencing trauma. And so whether it's what we sometimes will call the big T or the little T, you got those huge catastrophic events, those hurricanes, those whatever, or if it's just like interactions that cause you over time, to second guess some things about yourself or to experience some maladaptive emotional responses. Those things happen. And I didn't pay enough attention to those things across the years, and did a lot of explaining to people how they should, but didn't really do a lot of it myself. And so got to a point to where it started to really, the lies started to tell me who I was, and I began to listen to them. And it took somebody willing to invest in me when I wasn't, to really shake my head loose and get a little bit better perspective and start to do some work to right that ship, I guess you could say. But
there's like 10 different things that you said that I wanted to hope to remember to respond to. None
of them were probably my own thing, so it's okay. You're good.
That's okay. One being that so many of us experience trauma and stress and adversity, whether it's in childhood or as an adult. And I think the past 24 months or so, really has elevated those numbers a lot, to where I think even people who used to not think of themselves as stressed now can relate to that. One of the last things you said about investing in ourselves, when we don't think enough of ourselves to invest, other people investing in us when we don't think enough to invest in ourselves. And I definitely have had a few of those people in my life as well. I was reading up on you this morning, some of the things you've said. And one of the things you said before is that broken crayons still color, and several things about the importance of relationships. And so one of the things I like to talk to people are the people and events that kind of change their trajectory. So while you're talking about not always taking the best care of yourself or paying attention to what's going on with you, which I also think is common when you're coming from trauma, because you either have to suppress it or deal with it, and a lot of us choose to suppress it. What were some of those people and events that maybe helped you realize you needed to change your way of thinking or pay attention to what was happening to you?
I think the most impactful moment, and I very specifically remember it, was looking someone in the face and saying, I don't want help, and seeing the look of just pure pain on that person's face, and then having a follow-up conversation about how it wasn't that person's responsibility to help me get the things that I needed, but that there was an unwillingness to give up on me. And when you finally realize, you start to look through that lens of adding value back to yourself. I often with my students and with a lot of people, I do a drill where I have them write zeros until they get tired of writing zeros. And then I ask them what the value is, that number. And they always say, well, it has no value. It's worthless. And I have them add a 1 to it, and it immediately changes the value of that number. And when that 1 is added back into your self-assessment, then it changes the entire outlook. And at that moment, when that 1 came back in because of that person who refused, to quit fighting, it changed the lens to realize all the support group that's there. That's why I wanted you to call this individually ordinary, collectively radical, because you realize that there is a lot surrounding you that's positive. You have a lot of people in your corner. A lot of times we are just oblivious to it because of that lens, that worthless lens that we're using, that we're filtering everything through. So that's what I try to talk to people about now, whether it's my students or just somebody who sits down and feels safe to need that moment of vulnerability where they can just let it all go and talk. It's reminding them that we are absolutely not alone. And it just takes that moment of reminding yourself that you have value and that there are people around. And so that's where that trauma-informed perspective comes in.
Yeah, that really resonates with me. I think back to not letting people help me, not wanting to accept help. And it's only really been since the trauma work has started that I've started looking at where that comes from. And I think sometimes it comes from how we were raised, where help wasn't available. If help is not an option, then you don't know how to ask for or accept help because it doesn't exist for you.
Yeah. And going back to my students, the reason that I've dug in so hard with them in this second or third iteration of me being able to be a instructor at a college is my generation. You didn't talk about, I don't even know if people went to therapy. And I would dare say that the generation before me, it was as much or even less something that you talked about. But you move forward to now my college age students and probably even like the age of my children, it's from a societal standpoint, from a cultural standpoint, people are much more aware of their emotions. They're much more aware of scenarios that they have encountered, and they're much more aware of how it's become less taboo to talk about some of that stuff. And so that's why I feel like it's important in a criminal justice curriculum to start talking about, as a police officer, how I should be more aware of the fact that people are more aware of their emotions and what they might have endured, instead of just being like, what's wrong with you? Put them in handcuffs kind of deal. So
we recently, Jacob was in on this call. We met with some representatives from 3 different law enforcement agencies to talk about the WCCI presentation, trauma and resilience, and the impacts, long-term, positive and negative, and just had lots of conversations about the belief system of different, military, law enforcement, first responders. It's that deny what's happening and just keep going kind of thing, and how to make that safer. And so I imagine, and I hear that that's a culture where you're not supposed to really feel what you're feeling and just kind of keep going on and deny whatever it is that you feel like is happening right now.
Well, it definitely has been that way at a societal level, because even, from a CrossFit perspective, and you and I talked about this in the podcast, somebody's doing burpees and they're just like starting to fall apart. The number one move is to jump in and be like, come on, you got it. Push harder, push harder, push harder. And it might also be that person has been fighting anxiety attacks all day and they're giving what they've got. And me sitting there yelling at them and standing on the back of their neck is not really helping them get through that any at all. But in law enforcement, it's very much that. And it's very refreshing to see the changes that are coming. Last week, 2 weeks ago, we had a panel at Lisa McRae and had representative from Apps Counseling Center, and Kat Eller came from Boone PD. And then one of my colleagues was a police chief in Sugar Mountain, I believe. And there was also a representative from Campus Police who was a long time at Watauga Sheriff. And they all had very good insight to share for the students, but they also represented the fact that we as a culture, I think, are shifting from that don't ask, be tough, strap up your boots kind of thing, and to recognizing that there might be more going on and we'd be more beneficial and safer in general if we took that approach and had more of that perspective. So that was a really cool opportunity for me. And I've heard some about how yours went. It sounds really encouraging as well.
Yeah. And not even just law enforcement. Like, I was a parent who had that mentality. If there's not a bone sticking out of our skin, we keep on going. We do what we need to do. And that worked really well for my son, who was the older one. And it was a miserable failure with my daughter, who reacted really strongly to that method of parenting. And so trying to figure out, and still trying, she's 17 now, but still trying to figure out, what she's just not that mentality. Like you said, she's just not that way. And so I think we think of it most often in like military law enforcement, but I think it is a form of parenting as well. Well, unless you you're bleeding or we're going to the hospital, then you're expected to carry on. And I think that's especially true in the mountains.
Right.
That's a pretty
And
common form of thinking.
thinking back to what we were talking about earlier about understanding what you have gone through as an individual and how you handle it, that comes into play as well. And if my personal way of handling things is for something to get tough, something to go wrong, is for me to immediately catastrophize and for me to immediately go all or nothing and to just let my insecurities go through the roof and say, well, I'm not enough. I shouldn't have done this. I messed up by all these self-deprecating things. And that doesn't really help from a parenting standpoint, or dealing with anyone else otherwise, so it takes putting in personal work to be able to serve other people, much less to lead other people. And that's a tough thing when generationally we didn't do any of that stuff. So
Yeah, no, I've really appreciated hearing about people with trauma and their way their brains think about things. And you're right, there is this like shutting down or responding, overreacting kind of thing. And again, I use my children as an example. One of them is the warrior and the other one shuts down. And so I have always been more of the warrior mentality where I perceive a threat and I overreact. And through all this trauma work that I've been doing, it's been interesting to me to now go into a situation where I perceive a threat and try to decide, do I need to be the warrior? Do I not want to be the warrior? My therapist said to me the other day, you can experience growth in less dramatic ways. And so that was really helpful to me to think that I can make a decision about not reacting and then some huge, not overreacting and not shutting down, but reacting in a way that's reasonable and appropriate for the situation. So
right.
Always learning new things.
And I had I don't remember, I keep looking like I'm gonna get the answer. I don't remember where I was listening to it, but it was listening to something from Oprah, and she described as a kid how her life was so uncertain, her living arrangement was so uncertain, that they always put a chair under the door at night to make sure that nobody could get in, because they were trying to control what they could about the situation. And she said she was, I think, 38 years old before she realized that she still controlled every aspect of her life, including her relationship with her husband and everything like that. And that what in the moment was a response that helped her to feel control in a situation where she had no control had turned into a maladaptive response because she was just controlling people, and it wasn't pertinent.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the biggest things is we do form emotional responses, and we have to understand that at some point they're not helpful, they're not healthy anymore. But when we're encountering other people, so from a trauma informed standpoint, when we're encountering other people, when we're having a conversation with other people, mentoring other people, we have to assume that someone has been through trauma and that they may still be in that state where they haven't realized that their emotional response they formed out of safety in that moment may at this moment be maladaptive, but it could impact the interaction. So if their response was to immediately wall off emotionally to protect themselves from the abuse that was about to come on, it may not actually apply in this situation, but instead of being like, what's wrong with you? Why won't you communicate this and that, is to understand people may be still in that state of working through what was a helpful response and may not be anymore. So
yeah, Candace is on this call. We do a lot of training in the schools, and initially teachers wanted a little checklist of boxes, right? What trauma looks like. How do I know when a kid's been through trauma? And we talked a lot about universal precautions, like healthcare workers wear gloves to go into any room, no matter what they think they're walking into. And that's really how we feel like we should treat people, is to assume that they've come from trauma, because how we treat them, if you're not coming from trauma, won't do you any harm. But if that way we're not missing trauma or misdiagnosing things just to assume it about everyone. And those compassion and empathy and relationships, they're good for anybody, no matter what your background is.
That's a really good point. Really good way to say it.
So people and events that kind of help you change your thinking. You talked some about the first time that you said to somebody, I don't want any help. Any other notable points at which you kind of realized I might start doing something different?
Well, I guess we can touch on it and then move on from it. But when that moment comes that you move out of your own house, it kind of kind of wakes you up to the reality that you need to do something. So.
Yeah, and I think we could generalize that to those big events that happen, and I've had several of them even lately, where you kind of look around and go, I did not expect to find myself here, kind of thing.
Yeah, those big jarring moments, because even in that moment that was an environmental change, life change, that even just sparked some revelation, some reflection about other things, other peripheral things that just were missed, and changes that needed to be happening physically, emotionally, that kind of stuff. So, but a lot of people don't have the luxury. I say luxury like it's been pleasant. A lot of people don't have the luxury of going through those kind of life-altering moments. And that's a hard place to sit.
Yeah, it can be really scary and sad and tough. Well, thinking about wellness, because I know you're a big fitness enthusiast, thinking about wellness, so I've had two conversations. In the very beginning of these conversations, I wanted to know, what do you do to stay well? And then the more I had these conversations, the more I realized most of us know the list: sleep and eat and exercise and all those things. What's interesting to me is knowing the list, why we either choose not to do them or it takes us so long that we start to experience negative impact. So what are some things that you do to maintain a clear mind and your own wellness, and how do you know when it's time for you to do those things?
So that's actually been one of the biggest growth points through this whole process for me, was that one of the, if not the very first thing that we did was defined health. A definition of it doesn't do any good. You have to have an operational definition, things that you can measure and show that you're accomplishing. So if I say I'm healthy, then nobody knows what that means. I don't even know what that means. But if I say I got 8 hours of sleep each night, that I consumed half my body weight in water every day, those kind of operational definitions are huge. You have to be able to not just checklist it, but you have to be able to see that you're doing it and see improvement, right? So the first thing I did was made a definition of health. And after a while, that was just a very basic, you got to pull your life together kind of definition. Once that was reached, and it was pretty consistently reached, and I've gone back and rewritten the definition of health to be a much more extensive, much more exhaustive definition. And it still has those operational line items to it, but I have it on my phone right now. I have both of them on my phone. So that for me is the first thing, is I have to know what health means before I can even start to pursue it. From there, to your question, it's am I hitting those benchmarks? If not, is it because maybe they were not appropriate benchmarks? Like one of the things that we set was my physical fitness was going to be moving 15 minutes a day. That's way more doable when I know that I can go for a walk with my headphones around the neighborhood versus I needed to hit 3 CrossFit workouts in a day. I don't have the mental space for it, the physical space for it. So that's a much more attainable goal, and it's measurable. So that was a big step. And then a lot of times for me, it's probably in backwards order. It's like, okay, I'm starting to struggle. Some of those maladaptive thoughts are coming in. Am I doing the things that I'm supposed to be doing on the list? And if I was to take a poll of some people close in my life, I would get a stank face, because I don't quickly go back to them. Yeah, because that's hard work, and it's easier to say, well, I don't have the time for it, than it is to remember that I made this list for a reason, and maybe I need some accountability, but maybe I just need the self-will to make myself put in that work. And so that's kind of the thought process that's been taught to me over the past several months, and the one that I try to instill, and I don't do it. It's not pretty all the time, but it's there.
Well, and you mentioned other people holding you accountable. Mary's on this call, and one of the first Wednesday conversations we ever did were on relational care, community care, and I loathe the term self-care, because it just feels like, to me, one more thing I'm responsible for on my own, and I can't have one more thing that I'm responsible for on my own. Right. And so we talk a lot about having somebody to support us in that, or to remind us when it's time to do something to take care of ourselves. I was interviewing Brett Loftus once, who runs a business he does organizational training on organizational trauma-informed practices. And he said when he walks out on Wednesdays, he's like, so I'm going to therapy. anybody in here has a therapist, you haven't been in a while, time to go. Like, let me know why you're not going to therapy. And he also says, and I haven't seen you today to need help from me. And I thought that was the coolest thing, because we started this conversation with this, being okay asking for help and not knowing how to ask for help. And so maybe sometimes people need to tell us they expect us to come to us for help, to come to them for help. So he does this whole organizational culture thing around supporting, caring for each other. And I just thought that was really cool.
That's been a hard thing for me to grasp too, especially from a role of trying to create a culture where people have the vulnerability and safe space to come and talk. From a personal standpoint, it's just now recognizing how hard it is to actually answer the question, what do you need? Because I was real good at saying, I don't know, or nothing. It's hard, one, just to open up and tell somebody what you actually need. That's kind of embarrassing. That's kind of vulnerable, whatever. But then I'm realizing even just recently that it takes a lot of toll on your body and your mind to even come up with that answer to tell somebody. And so it's easier to say, I've got you, I support you. But it's harder to be able to answer that question when people ask you.
I agree with that. Recently, I can't remember, it's been a pretty rough year. And someone said to me several times, can I bring you a cup of tea? Can I, she gave me concrete, can I bring you this? Can I get you that? Do you need me to call you right now so you can talk for a minute? And so I agree with you, especially when we're under stress or pressure and somebody says to me, what do you need? Well, I don't have a clue. And offering those concrete things was really helpful for me. And then not only could I say, no, I don't need that, but I would like, and then one time she said, so I'm coming right now and I'm bringing you something. So you can name it and get what you want, or I'm just going to guess and maybe get the wrong thing, but I'm coming now and I'm bringing you something. And that was helpful to me too. And then I was able to say, well, actually, no, I don't want tea, but I'll take a, Sprite or something like that.
Right. Those people that show up whether you want to or not, they're kind of annoying, aren't they?
Yeah, pretty persistent and consistent. Right. You said something else, asking for help. Oh, when we did the conference last spring, one of the speakers was talking about how people say, well, I'll have an open door policy. You're always welcome. At my door, it's always open. And the speaker said, we forget that people don't even know how to get to our door, that they are so consumed with whatever they're dealing with in the moment. They either forgot how to get there, never knew in the first place, aren't sure how they'll be received when they arrive. And so it's bigger than my door's always open. It's a way of, bridging that connection and strengthening that relationship in a different way, which was really interesting to me.
Yeah. And to me, that phrase, it almost doesn't carry enough weight to convince somebody they can do it. You have to create that culture, that safe space to where somebody organizationally or just with you personally can feel like they can do that. But then, like you said, they have to be able to find their way there. And from a coaching standpoint, a lot of that came into knowing your people, having the culture, having the safe space there, but also knowing when someone was in a space, how to meet them in that. Because not everybody, that not everybody's the same. And so that was a tough thing to learn from a coaching standpoint, from a business owner standpoint, but it was effective. Now, kind of jumping gears to my criminal justice students, that's something that's kind of hard to teach them because you're encountering somebody for the first time and you don't have that luxury of knowing how they react, what their mannerisms are, what their background is, what trauma they're coming from. And so you have to just have that trauma-informed mindset of being able to give people the space to feel like they can talk and then help guide them to those resources. But you as a person have to be that open door. And that phrase has always been kind of iffy with me. And I've seen it play out where students know that the sticker's on the door, but they also don't feel like they can utilize it. So
yeah,
it's a tough thing to navigate.
It is, I agree. So thinking about, because another thing I read is your emphasis on relationships and being there for one another. And you've mentioned several of the things that helped you recognize things in yourself were relationship kind of things. Mm-hmm. And we've had a conversation before on here about, for people who aren't from trauma, how do we best support people who are? How can we how can we help them to feel that support, that it's not just empty words? And we've talked about being specific in the things that you offer, and maybe coming to the person instead of having them come to you. Are there other things that you can think of, either that would have helped you when you were trying to figure out how to accept help, or as you've come along, that you feel like are important for people to know when they're reaching out to people who have trauma experiences?
Yeah, it would have been helpful for people who were interacting with me, and I'm learning that it's much more helpful for me to carry this in interacting with other people, is that even if you can't empathize, even if you don't agree, it's important to understand that a person's perspective in an emotional and a traumatic sense is, in that moment, it's accurate because it's theirs. And so it's important to meet them and not give them the space to share that, and to feel like it's okay that they are doing that because it's what they perceive to be true in the moment. So we might help them navigate it in the long run, but in that moment, sitting with them and giving them a chance to actually just share in that feeling of what I'm experiencing is valid and okay, might go a long way in building that rapport and giving a chance for further conversations along the way, instead of just being like, well, listen, that's not true.
Mm.
And that happened a lot with me, and I have done that a lot as well. And it's one of those things that I'm trying to work on being better about.
It's difficult. I think sometimes we protect ourselves and we don't want to believe that thing is possible, because then what does that mean about our view of the world?
Mm-hmm.
When we do the WCCI presentation, we talk about changing language and how the old belief was they're just seeking attention, or they're just, crying out for help, or they're not being honest, they're exaggerating what happened to them. And how, the frame of thinking now is that often people don't exaggerate, they minimize, and that all behavior is a form of communication. And so trusting, that however they're representing it to us is what's real for them at the time. So being fully present, non-judgmental.
Yeah, and if you're in a state of crisis, or you're just struggling emotionally in a moment, and you say to me X, and I immediately respond with, well, that's not true. I have immediately put that wall up to where your safe space, your right to be vulnerable with me is just not there. And so it's not that I have to be like, oh, I agree 100% with what you're saying, but it's important for me to say, I hear you and I'm with you in this moment, and then maybe come back later and talk about it or whatever. But that's one thing that I saw. I was on a call one time with this kid. He was like 6'5", 300 pounds, biggest kid I've ever seen. He was maybe 14 years old. And there were two people there. An old officer, he was a major in the Marine Corps. The kid was being loud and rowdy and everything with his mom. The old school guy walks up and whispers something in his ear to make him react. And then literally he punched him in the mouth. The officer punched him in the mouth. There was a fight, all this other stuff. And so they get him all calm, and he's sitting on the bed again, and he's just still trying to deal with his emotions. And it was clear at that point that something was going on with the kid. Another guy had been there like 30 years, came and sat down beside him and started playing, I think it was Legos. He started playing Legos with him or something like that. And the big kid just calmed down immediately. And when it was all said and done, he ended up going to mental health. And instead of going to jail or anything like that, well, he was 13, 14. But anyway, and I asked the seasoned guy, so how did you know to do that? And he said, well, been doing this a long time. I've learned that there are different ways to communicate with people, but also I learned from a kid and some of the stuff that I went through that sometimes what you are experiencing is real to you, even if it's not to other people. And it just takes somebody to listen to that, to get you to a place to where you can figure out what's best for you. And I'll never forget that incident. So
it's real to you, even if it's not real to somebody else. Yeah. I've been doing this job a long time, social work, and I've talked to all kinds of people with all kinds of mindsets and all kinds of realities. And very early on, when I was trying to figure out how to communicate with people who I was having a hard time with, all of a sudden visuals come to me. And I thought, there's just going to be times when I have to get in a boat and go to their island of reality. It doesn't matter if that's where I think I am, but that's where we're going to have to go. And that was so helpful to me. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It just means that it's maybe somewhere else from where I'm standing now. Mm-hmm. So I don't even know where that came from, but it was been very helpful to me.
I'm going to use that one.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about, you've mentioned your students several times, bringing trauma-informed practices into, whether it's a classroom or you've also brought it into a business before.
Mhm.
Are there some basic common things that you do to, because we're probably talking about students, and I experience this with my students too, who've either never heard of trauma really, or have denied their own trauma the whole time. So kind of where do you start with people who are maybe hearing about this for the first time? How do you bring this into people's consciousness?
Well, the beauty of the criminal justice curriculum is that whatever course, whether it's my intro to criminal justice or an upper level victimology course, is that they all kind of follow a similar structure in the theories behind stuff and things of that nature. So there was a commonality in each of them where I snuck in a whiteboard segment that was not in the book about trauma and trauma's impact on the body and things of that nature. And the reason I did it was because, like I said, pretty much everybody has or has the potential to experience trauma. And this generation is a little bit more aware of or exposed to treatment for trauma. And so I've had students in the past that I've not lost physically, but I've lost them for periods of time during the semester or reactions during exams and things of that nature that in reflection probably came from some traumatic events in the past. And so I do this at the beginning so that the students know that there's a little bit more of a communication, and because it's preparing them to go into a field within criminal justice, whether police, attorney, that kind of thing, so that they'll understand it a little bit more. And I just throw that chapter or that section into the chapter. I test them on it, 1 or 2 questions on the big exam. And then, like I said, we had that panel that was really informative. And so it's just something where I taught a whole class on it in Charlotte about the impact of the profession on the actual individual law enforcement official and citizens and that kind of thing. And I don't have that class right now. So I just kind of sneak it in as a day in each of the classes and just kind of open up that conversation. And it's been really good so far. There's been a lot of candid discussions in class and after class so far, which has been exciting.
Yeah, I guess it's a dream of mine to get it into like at least like when you say a week, a topic a week, a day or something in criminal justice, education, business department, public health, social work. Hopefully we'll keep working on it. Maybe we'll get there one day.
Yeah, it's definitely needed and it's very relevant. I haven't had a single student or in any of the classes or any of my colleagues that have been like, this is stupid. That has nothing to do with what we're talking about. So
yeah, it's been interesting to me, whether it's somebody with a high A score or medium A score or a 0 A score, if you have come from trauma experiences, it resonates with you because it's your life. If you haven't had any that you feel like are identified trauma experiences, you have a heart for people and helping people who do. I just have not met anyone who is like, this is stupid. I'm not buying into this at all. Like, I don't ever need to hear about this again. It just hasn't happened for me.
right. And talking about the neurological, the physiological impacts as well, kind of brought it into reality for them. So I wasn't just standing up talking like a therapist in class. I talked about the actual changes to the brain, how children are more resilient than we are as adults, how their brains can shift back, that kind of stuff. And so that, I think that made it a little bit more grounding to them as well when they heard some of the science behind it.
I didn't tell you I was going to ask you this question, so you can tell me that you can answer it. But I talk a lot about feeling in my head, the 2 parts of my brain kind of smashing up against each other, the parts that were engineered in trauma that I kind of visualize as peach pits, those black hard, they're just yucky. And then the healthy part of my brain that's more pink and more flexible and resilience. And I feel those 2 parts of my brains kind of bumping up against each other sometime. How can you give us any insight into what it's like to have a certain set of values and then be trying to make that shift to a different set and the difficulty of that? I didn't tell you I was going to ask you
No,
this
that's
one.
okay. What I was thinking about was in this moment, I realized that the value shift from me was from values that probably were not as aligned with me as I would have wanted them to be. Because the values that I would have always listed as core values and the values that I used at the business and now are the ones that I still would hold, and the ones that even through trauma and treatment and growth and everything, I would still would hold. But I think I held them in the moment or in that season, but I actually wasn't working hard to align things through them, if that makes sense. And I didn't realize it until just now. So thanks for that big reflection. I'll deal with that later.
I'm sorry. Write it down. Be sure to make a note.
But if that's been that hard to shift, I would imagine this is just pure speculation that if anyone is changing their values, that it's got to be even more difficult, and it's got to be a full understanding of what they are and why they are important, why they need to be shifted, as well as how it's going to be accomplished. And it's got to be an internal thing, but something that big can't be done on your own. I mean, I keep going back to this whole relationship thing, accountability thing. That's not something you're going to be able to do. You shouldn't try to do on your own, because if they were your values then and you're shifting them, it's going to be hard enough to battle yourself in that one, much less to, it'd be much more beneficial to include somebody else in that. And that's the way organizations do it. The core values don't get changed. To my experience, they don't get changed by one person and then just handed out on a piece of paper. There's always been, whether it's a small group or the entire group, it's always been conversations about who are we, what matters to us. We recently, before the world ended, we're going through a whole reconsideration, restructuring of what the nonprofit looked like. And that came down to the core values, the mission, the vision statement. And that was a hard enough exercise in and of itself, just to say, what do we want to write on this board? Never mind for it to be my life values that I'm changing. So yeah, that would be a tough thing. And like I said, it was hard enough for me to just now to realize the stuff that I still value and valued back then, I probably wasn't working hard enough to use as my filter through all my thoughts and decisions and actions. So,
well, and what you said, so I had an insight too. What you said made me think we have this set of values, and then we're raised in a house or given a life or step into a life. And there's a whole new set of values that comes from having to survive trauma. And those the things conflicting and maybe not even knowing what our values are, because we have to align to this set to survive the situation. And those things being in conflict and trying to figure out who we are and what our values are and how we're going to be true to those things. That's a whole nother battle besides the surviving of the trauma. So you gave me something to think about too. I'll make a note as well. So let's see. Anything I haven't asked you about that you want to speak on or share before we think about to wrap up?
Oh, this is almost like asking me what I need. I feel like I'm supposed to have an answer. I don't have it.
Now, every once in a while, somebody's like, oh yeah, I wish this is my, and so like any last magical thoughts, that's more pressure.
Yeah, no, it's, for me, the reason I was excited about jumping on here and with the work that you do is that it's about educating and encouraging a trauma-informed perspective in whatever it is you do. So we had the business, got teaching students, had law enforcement, but it all comes down to the importance of that. And part of being successful in walking that out is understanding a couple of key points, which we've touched on, done a great job of asking. But, it's understanding that people potentially are coming from some type of trauma, and regardless of what we see as the severity of that trauma, it is real to the individual. They may or may not be in a healthy place of knowing how to wrestle with that, and that our interactions with people should reflect that. Whether we're talking about encountering somebody on the street as a police officer or mentoring somebody on how to be a trauma-informed leader, is we gotta understand that stuff. But the biggest thing is that we need to understand that we, as the person who's encountered trauma, and we as the people who are interacting with people with trauma, have to do it together. We got to have relationships, and those relationships will keep us moving even when we may not want to or may not be able to. And that's what's big about what you're doing, and what I love about this initiative is you're fostering that culture in a high coach, and that's a big deal.
One of my favorite things to say is the number one factor to offset trauma is relationship with a positive, consistent, caring adult. Like every one of those interactions heals a brain in some way. And so that gives me hope, because you don't have to have some special certificate or a certain degree. Like anybody can walk out of a room and start healing somebody else's brain. I just think that's really powerful.
I keep going back to that old soul officer who sat down and played the Legos. I mean, he had no background whatsoever in that, but he knew that was a way he could meet that person, and it kept the kid from who knows what. So that's the approach we got to have.
Yeah, another thing that what you're saying reminded me of was not only is it real to them, but every single one of us perceive trauma so differently. And so even within families, you can have 3 siblings who experience the same traumatic event, and each one of them will report it differently. One of them will tell you nothing happened. One of them can't function, and the other one is somewhere in between. And so whether or not we judge another person's trauma, I was working with a mom, or I knew a mom one time, and she had a really traumatic history, a lot of domestic violence and physical and sexual abuse, substance abuse and addiction. And she had a daughter who was really struggling. And she was like, my daughter has no idea what it's like to really see real trauma. This happened to me and that happened to me. And that's what it's like to be traumatized. And the daughter's therapist said to her, her trauma is real to her. It doesn't matter if it's not your trauma. And it doesn't matter if you don't think her trauma is bad, like it's real for her. And that was a hard thing for that mom to learn. So just remembering that everybody's trauma is real to them. And
for sure.
Yeah.
And that's something that's kind of easier for us to do. I think of from like the gossip standpoint, so-and-so in the neighborhood down the road who, you can minimize their stuff. But it's when you get into those deeper relationships that we got to check ourselves and that kind of stuff, because that's the support structure that people need. And if we're minimizing or dismissing what people perceive to be trauma in their life, then we're not serving them, because it might not have even happened, or it might not have happened the way that they thought it did happen. But if they believe it, then it could really impact a lot of aspects of their life, a lot of areas of their life. And so we got to be able to meet people in that and understand that reality for them. So that's a hard thing to do sometimes.
Mercy. Well, we'll take a deep breath. If anybody has anything they'd like to say to Derek in the chat, I always copy and paste chats and email it to people to read later. Derek, I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to be with me today. I always think about things differently after I talk to you. So thank you for making time. It's good to see you, and I hope to talk to you again sometime soon. Good luck with your courses and the rest of what you've got going on in your life. And thank you for being with me.
Thank you. It's been an absolute honor, and I appreciate everybody who logged on too. So keep doing what y'all are doing, because you're making a huge impact.
Thanks. Hope you have a good day.
Thank you. You do the same.